The Veshan drop cruiser unfailing resolve shuddered through Earth's upper atmosphere at 17 kilometers per second, and Commander Dole Rithik watched the sensor dome reading scroll across his terminal with the idle half-attention of a man reviewing yesterday's weather. Atmospheric nitrogen-oxygen standard, carbon signatures consistent with a post-agricultural phase, probable population density. The sensor technician paused. "Commander, the density reading is wrong." Dole didn't look up from the small journal in his lap, a physical artifact, handwritten by the last Veshan survey chief who had visited this world 400,000 years ago. The journal described a planet of warm swamps and lumbering primates who chipped stones into crude blades. It described a world so negligible that the Conclave had classified it as a future resource reserve, to be harvested when its mineral content justified the fuel cost. The entry was 6 lines long, 6 lines for an entire world. "Define wrong," Dole said. "The density projection should be near zero. The models predicted extinction-level climate shift around cycle 1800, but I'm reading organized structures, thousands of them." Dole finally looked up. Outside the forward viewport, the cloud layer was thinning, and through it, something caught the sunlight below, a hard, geometric flash that should not have existed on a world of swamps and stone chippers. He set the journal aside. "Continue descent. Standard survey protocol." The transit to Earth had taken 14 days, and Dole had used the time the way any experienced survey commander would, reviewing the target world's file, checking his team's equipment certifications, and sleeping well. The file on Earth was thin, thinner than any other harvest-grade world in the current audit batch. Most deferred planets accumulated data over the centuries: spectral analyses, atmospheric models, biosphere projections. Earth's file had 6 lines, 26 probe confirmations that nothing had changed, and a mineral yield projection that the Geological Division had flagged as promising in the 600,000 cycle window. That was it, a world reduced to a mining timetable. On the 7th day of transit, Dole had invited Tavan to his quarters to review the landing plan. Tavan had sat across the narrow table, the journal between them, and pointed at Yenth's sketch with one armored claw. "I've seen cave crawlers on Veshan Prime with more promising neural architecture than this," Tavan had said. "Are we certain the Conclave couldn't have automated this survey?" "The Conclave wants tissue samples and core drills on harvest-grade worlds," Dole had replied. "Probes can scan, they can't dig." Tavan had tapped the sketch. "Look at it, Commander. 400,000 years ago this was the planet's apex predator. Stone tools and herd behavior. Even if it survived, which the models say it didn't, where could it possibly go? We've had spaceflight for 9,000 years and we haven't changed our fundamental biology. This species had stone tools. There are limits." Dole had agreed, because the logic was sound, because every precedent in the Conclave's 11,000-year survey history supported it, because no species in the galactic record had ever done what these primates would have needed to do to become something other than negligible. Now, standing on engineered grass that was smarter than his atmospheric processor, watching a city that made Veshan architecture look like a child's mud stack, Dole understood that the logic had been sound, and the precedent had been correct, and the conclusion had still been catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. The problem was not the analysis. The problem was the species. 400,000 years is not a number the Veshan mind processes casually. It is the span in which continents drift, ocean floors become mountain ranges, and species either calcify into evolutionary dead ends or vanish entirely. When the Conclave had dispatched Dole's survey team to reassess Earth, one of 900 deferred harvest worlds on the current audit cycle, the briefing had lasted 11 minutes. The analyst had used the word formality twice. Dole had assembled his team of 14, with the same energy one might bring to inventorying a storage locker. His second, Tavan Orish, had complained about the assignment over their meal rations on the third day of transit. 400,000 years and they send a survey cutter, Tavan had said, mandibles clicking in the Veshan equivalent of an eye roll. We could send a probe and save the fuel. The Conclave wants boots on soil for harvest-grade worlds, Dole had replied. We land, take samples, confirm the biomass is harvestable, file the claim, and we're home in 6 rotations. That conversation played in his mind now, as the unfailing resolve punched through the last cloud layer, and the world below opened up like a wound. The city filled the horizon. Not a ruin, not the crumbled remnant of something that had once aspired to significance and then collapsed under its own ambition. A city. Living, breathing, impossibly vast, its towers rising in silver and white columns that caught the midday sun and threw it back in blinding sheets. The tallest structures exceeded 2 kilometers in height, their surfaces laced with transit lines and atmospheric stabilizers that pulsed with a faint blue luminescence even in broad daylight. Between the towers, suspended bridges arced in impossible geometries, carrying traffic that moved in orderly streams, vehicles, thousands of them, glinting like insects in formation. Parks and green corridors threaded through the urban mass, precise and deliberate, not the chaotic sprawl of a civilization struggling against itself, but the ordered discipline of a species that had solved its own nature and built accordingly. Dole stood at the forward viewport and said nothing. Behind him, the bridge crew had gone quiet. Commander, the sensor technician's voice had lost its professional detachment. I'm reading additional population centers, 17 within this continental mass alone. The largest is approximately 300 kilometers north. Its commander, it's larger than this one. How large? Estimated footprint of 9,000 square kilometers. Population estimate is, another pause. The instruments aren't calibrated for this. I'm reading in the billions for the continental total. Dole's clawed hands tightened on the viewport rail. The journal in his quarters described a world of perhaps 200,000 scattered primates. Creatures who feared thunder and huddled in caves when the rain came. Run a full-spectrum geological survey, he ordered. I want mineral composition, subterranean structure, electromagnetic field mapping, everything. The geological officer, a young technician named Prell who had been excited about this posting, because easy surveys looked good on a junior record, ran the scan. What came back made her mandibles lock open. Commander, the subterranean readings are, I don't know how to interpret these. There are organized structures beneath the surface, not natural formations, engineered cavities extending to a depth of 12 kilometers. Some of them are pressurized. 12 kilometers. The deepest Veshan excavation on record is 400 meters, Commander. Dole said nothing. He looked at the city filling the viewport and tried to recalibrate his understanding of what he was seeing. It was not a city built on the surface of a planet. It was the visible fraction of something much larger, an infrastructure that extended kilometers into the bedrock beneath it, rooted like a living organism, as if the species that had built it did not merely live on their world but had merged with it. Take us down, he ordered. Landing Protocol 7, open terrain, outside the urban perimeter. We don't approach the structures until we understand what we're looking at. 400,000 years earlier, the first Veshan survey team had landed on this same continent in a craft not unlike the unfailing Resolve. Commander Yenth Sohul, the author of the 6-line journal entry, had spent 4 days on the surface. His notes were almost comically dismissive. Dominant species bipedal tool adjacent, stone implements observed, no metallurgy, no agriculture beyond accidental cultivation, neural capacity within range for eventual sapience but no current evidence of organized thought, recommend deferral, mineral reserves will improve with geological cycling. Return window, 500,000 cycles minimum. Yinth had not bothered to name the species. In the journal margin, he had sketched one of the primates, a hunched figure holding a chipped rock, rendered with the careless speed of a man documenting something beneath his professional interest. Below the sketch, a single annotation, negligible. That word had traveled 400,000 years through the Conclave's filing system, attached to the world like a permanent diagnosis. Negligible, not worth a second visit until the minerals ripened. The primates would either evolve into something interesting, unlikely, per the models, or go extinct. Either way, irrelevant to the harvest schedule. Dole had read the word before departure and felt nothing. Now, staring at a city that dwarfed anything the Veshan had built in their 12,000-year imperial history, he felt the word rearrange itself in his mind like a bone snapping and resetting at the wrong angle. The unfailing resolve settled onto a broad plain of engineered grassland, 3 kilometers south of the nearest towers. The grass itself was wrong, too uniform, too green, cut to a precise height that spoke of maintenance on an industrial scale. As the landing struts compressed and the hull groaned through its cooling cycle, Dole assembled his team at the main ramp. 14 Veshan in light survey armor, sensor packs, geological samplers, atmospheric processors. No heavy weapons, survey teams didn't carry them. They had sidearms rated for animal deterrence, the kind of low-yield pulse tools designed to discourage a charging herbivore, not to fight a war. Tavin stood beside him as the ramp lowered, and the air of this world washed over them. Warm, clean, carrying a faint scent of something floral that the atmospheric processor identified as engineered pollen, a biological air filtration system woven into the grassland itself. "The grass is cleaning the air," Tavin said, mandibles half open in the Veshan display of unease. "The grass is an air filtration system." "I see it." "Commander, the swamp primates built air filtration grass." "I see it, Tavin." Prell had dropped to one knee at the base of the ramp, running her handheld geological sampler through the topsoil. "Commander, the soil composition isn't natural. It's been engineered at the molecular level. There are synthetic microorganisms in here, biological machines, Commander. They're maintaining the soil chemistry in real time. This grassland isn't growing. It's being operated." Dole filed the information alongside everything else that no longer fit the journal's description and started walking. The city grew in front of them with every step, its scale becoming more oppressive as the distance closed. What had looked like smooth tower surfaces from altitude resolved, at ground level, into intricate facades, structural lattices of a composite material that Dole's handheld scanner could not identify. Not metal, not polymer, something else, something the scanner's database had no reference for, and the Veshan material database contained over 40 million entries. As they crossed the 600-meter mark from the city's edge, Dole noticed something in the ground beneath them, a grid of fine lines, barely visible, running in precise parallels beneath the grass. His scanner identified them as conductive pathways carrying a low-level electromagnetic current. "Sensor net," Tavin said quietly. "We've been standing on their sensor net since we stepped off the ramp. They knew our boot weight before we took 2 steps. The first human appeared moments later. She was standing on a raised platform that extended from the nearest tower's base, a terrace of white stone overlooking the grassland, and she was watching them approach with an expression that Dole could not read. Tall by Veshan standards, upright. 2 arms, 2 legs, bilateral symmetry, the basic bipedal architecture that Yinth's journal had described. But where Yinth had drawn a hunched, tentative creature gripping a stone tool, this individual stood with the relaxed authority of someone who owned the ground beneath her feet and the sky above it. She wore a uniform of dark material that fit close to her frame, marked at the shoulders with insignia that Dole's cultural analysis software attempted to parse, and then flagged as unknown system. Her hair was pulled back from her face, and her eyes tracked the Veshan team's approach with the steady, unhurried attention of someone who had been expecting them. That was the detail that lodged in Dole's mind like a splinter. She was not surprised. 14 armed aliens had just landed a spacecraft on her doorstep, and she looked as if she'd been waiting for the morning mail. "She's alone," Tavin observed. "She's not alone," Dole corrected. "She's the one they chose to show us." 400,000 years ago, Commander Yenth had encountered a group of the primates near a river delta on this same continent. His journal described the encounter with anthropological detachment. 12 individuals, mixed age and sex, fled upon visual contact. The largest male turned and displayed threat behavior, raised arms, vocalizations, before following the group into dense vegetation. No further interaction. The species appears to operate on instinct-driven herd dynamics. No evidence of hierarchical command structure or tactical coordination. Yenth had not pursued the group. There was no reason to pursue something negligible. He had taken his soil samples, logged his mineral readings, and departed orbit within the standard survey window. What Yenth had not recorded, because it would not have occurred to him to record it, was that the largest male had not fled with the others. According to archaeological data that Dole would never see, the male had circled back through the vegetation, followed the Veshan survey team for 2 days and watched them. Watched what they carried. Watched how they moved. Watched the craft that had brought them from the sky. And then, when the Veshan departed, the male had returned to his group and spent the remaining years of his life chipping stones into shapes that no longer resembled tools for cutting meat. They resembled the objects he had seen the sky visitors carry. It would take another 40,000 years for the descendants of that male's group to discover metallurgy. Another 100,000 to build their first permanent structures. Another 50,000 to reach their first industrial age, collapse it, rebuild it, collapse it again, and rebuild it a third time with the kind of grim, stubborn discipline that only a species familiar with its own capacity for self-destruction could sustain. And then, in a span of time that the Veshan Conclave's filing system would round to 0, they had done everything else. 160,000 years before Dole's arrival, a descendant of the primate who had watched Yenth's survey team, separated by 6,000 generations, carrying none of the original memory but all of the original restlessness, had stood on the shore of a cold ocean and watched the third Conclave monitoring probe descend through the upper atmosphere. She did not know what she was looking at. Her people had names for the stars and crude models for the movement of celestial bodies, but they had no concept of artificial spacecraft. The bright point of light that crossed the sky, paused, and then accelerated away again, was logged in her oral tradition as a visitation from the Skyfire spirits. A story told to children for 300 years before it faded into mythology and then faded out of memory entirely. But the woman had stood on the shore and watched, and something in the watching had stayed, not as a story, not as a memory, as a question. The same question the primate had asked 400,000 years ago, though neither of them would ever know they shared it. What are we not seeing? That question had driven her people to build boats, to cross the ocean, to find other lands and other peoples, and to fight them and trade with them and learn from them, and eventually, across a span of time that would fill the Conclave's filing systems with compressed centuries of progress, to build a civilization that asked the question in increasingly precise ways, until the answers started arriving in the form of mathematics, physics, chemistry, and engineering. The third probe had returned to the Conclave with standard data, negligible, no change, no threat. By the time the fourth probe arrived, 70,000 years later, the woman's descendants had split the atom. By the fifth, they had reached orbit. By the sixth, they had begun building the subterranean infrastructure that Prell's scanner would one day detect at a depth of 12 kilometers. And by the seventh, they had captured the probe, disassembled it, read the Conclave's harvest charter in its navigational firmware, and understood exactly what negligible meant in administrative terms. They did not panic. They did not transmit threats. They did not accelerate their military development in response to a specific enemy. They simply added one more item to the long list of things they were preparing for, alongside asteroid impacts, solar flares, ecological collapse, and their own capacity for self-destruction. The Conclave became a line item in a preparation budget that stretched across millennia. And they kept building, because building was what they did. Because the question, what are we not seeing, had no final answer, and a species that cannot stop asking a question cannot stop building toward the response. The woman on the terrace watched Dole's team halt at the platform's edge. She did not descend to meet them. She did not speak first. Dole's translator unit was cycling through linguistic databases, attempting to match the audio environment. There was sound coming from the city, layered and complex, a blend of spoken language, tonal signals, and something that registered as structured music embedded in the urban infrastructure itself. The translator found partial matches against 3 ancient languages in its archive, then abandoned all 3 and began building a new framework from scratch. "I am Commander Dole Rithik of the Veshan Conclave," Dole said, speaking the formal Veshan greeting protocol for pre-sapient or early sapient contact. He realized, as the words left his mandibles, how absurd the protocol sounded directed at the figure above him. "We are a survey team conducting a standard assessment of this world under Conclave Charter. We know what you are," the woman said. Her voice was calm. The translator caught the words and rendered them in Veshan with a half-second delay. It had built its framework that quickly. Dole noted this and felt something cold settle in his thorax. The Veshan language had taken the Conclave's best linguists 40 years to formalize. This species translation system had cracked it in the time it took to exhale. "You've been to this world before," the woman continued. 406,000 years ago by your calendar. A survey vessel, crew of 9, 4 days on the surface. Your commander described us as," she paused, and for the first time something moved across her face, an expression that Dole's social analysis software tagged as controlled amusement. "Negligible." The word hung in the air between them. "You know of the previous survey?" Dole asked. "We know of 27 previous visits by Conclave-affiliated vessels over the past 400,000 years. The first was your survey commander's official assessment. The remaining 26 were unmanned monitoring probes dispatched at irregular intervals. We detected and cataloged each one. We did not interfere with them." Dole's team had gone still behind him. He could hear Tavan's respiratory rate increase, the faint wheeze of air through stress spiracles. Behind them, Prell had stopped scanning the soil and was staring at the woman with her mandibles slightly apart, the Veshan expression of a mind trying to process something that didn't fit any available category. "You have been aware of the Conclave for approximately 390,000 years, yes. We detected the second probe 9,400 years after your initial visit. By that time, we had achieved atmospheric flight and basic orbital capability. We tracked the probe, analyzed its construction, and extrapolated the technology base of the civilization that had sent it." She folded her arms. "We chose not to respond." Dole felt the ground shift beneath him, not physically, but in the way that certainty shifts when one of its load-bearing assumptions is removed. The Conclave had sent 26 monitoring probes to this world. Standard procedure for deferred harvest planets. Check whether the mineral profile had improved, whether the biosphere had destabilized in useful ways, whether the dominant species had expired yet. Each probe had returned nominal data. No anomalies. No threat indicators. 26 times, the data had come back clean. 26 confirmations that Earth was exactly what Yinth had described, negligible. "Your probes were not malfunctioning," the woman said, reading his silence. "We allowed them to see what we wanted them to see." Atmospheric composition consistent with a pre-industrial biosphere. Surface temperature readings within your expected range. Population signatures suppressed to below your detection thresholds. You spoofed our probes. For 390,000 years, yes. The controlled amusement was gone from her face. What replaced it was something harder, not hostility, not threat, but the steady, level gaze of a species that had spent nearly 400 millennia preparing for this exact conversation, and was now, finally, having it. Why? Dole asked. The woman looked past him, toward the unfailing resolve sitting on the groomed grassland, its hull still venting heat shimmer into the bright air. She studied it the way a museum curator might study a donated artifact, with interest but without concern. "'Cause we needed to understand what you would do if you thought we were still negligible," she said. "Your harvest charter, we've read it, not from your transmissions, from the probe you sent during your 7th visit. It carried a compressed policy archive in its navigational firmware, standard Conclave practice. We decoded it within 6 hours of capture. Resource extraction protocol for non-sapient worlds, atmospheric processing, biomass conversion, mineral strip harvesting down to the mantle." She let the list settle. Now we know. Dole understood in that moment what the Conclave's harvest protocols actually meant when applied to a world someone was living on. He had read the protocols 1,000 times. They were administrative language, resource allocation procedures, the bureaucratic machinery of an empire that consumed worlds the way a factory consumed raw stock. Assess, classify, schedule, extract. He had never stood on one of those worlds and looked at the person who lived there, while the word extract echoed in his professional training. "Commander," Tavan's voice was low, close to his auditory ridge. "The sky." Dole looked up. They came over the city in formation, not from behind the towers, but from above them, descending through the upper atmosphere in a pattern so precise that the contrails they left formed geometric lines against the blue. Warships. Human warships, and they were nothing like anything in the Veshan database. The smallest was a kilometer long. Its hull was the same unidentifiable composite as the tower facades, dark and angular, built with the brutal economy of a species that understood exactly what warships were for, and did not waste a single panel on aesthetics. Weapons arrays lined its dorsal surface, not the clustered turret arrangements that the Veshan used, but long, integrated rails that ran the full length of the hull, glowing faintly at their forward apertures with a light that the sensor pack identified as contained plasma, and then reclassified as unknown energy type. Behind the first ship, 4 more. Behind those, 8. Behind those, a line that stretched to the horizon and continued beyond it. "How many?" Dole whispered. Tavan's sensor pack was clicking through readings. "I'm counting, Commander. I can't count them. They're still coming. The formation extends beyond orbital altitude. There are ships above the cloud layer that are larger than our formation has a classification for. Larger than a Conclave Grand Carrier. Commander, there are individual vessels in that formation that mass more than our entire sector fleet." Prell had been running a spectrographic analysis on the nearest warship's hull. Her scanner chimed with results and she read them, then read them again, then turned to Dole with an expression he had never seen on a junior officer's face, the look of someone whose professional training has just become obsolete. "Commander, the hull composite, I have a partial analysis. It's a metamaterial structured at the atomic level. Self-repairing. The molecular lattice reconfigures in response to energy input. If you hit it with a plasma bolt, the impact zone restructures to absorb the specific wavelength within 0.4 seconds. She swallowed. Our weapons wouldn't damage it. They would teach it. Dole looked at the journal he had left on the bridge. 6 lines. A sketch of a hunched primate holding a rock. Negligible. The woman on the terrace had not moved. She stood with her arms folded, watching Dole watch the fleet arrive, and her expression had not changed because her expression had never needed to change. This was not a display of force. This was a routine patrol returning to its home anchorage, rearranging itself slightly to pass over the landing zone, where 14 Veshen in light survey armor stood with geological samplers and animal deterrent sidearms. "You will not be harmed," the woman said. "Your vessel will not be impounded. You may leave when you choose. And if the Conclave sends a harvest fleet..." The woman was quiet for a moment. Above them, the nearest warship passed directly overhead, and its shadow fell across the landing zone like a wall sliding into place. In that shadow, the temperature dropped 4 degrees, and Dole could feel the static charge of the ship's drive systems prickling against his carapace. "The Conclave is welcome to try," she said. "But I would encourage you to share what you've seen here with whoever makes those decisions. Not as a threat. We don't need to threaten you. As information." She paused. 400,000 years ago, your people looked at ours and saw something negligible, something that chipped stones and feared thunder, and you wrote 6 lines about us in a book and never came back. Her voice was steady, measured, and underneath it Dole heard something that was not anger, not triumph, not contempt. It was patience. The vast, deep geological patience of a species that had been underestimated at the cellular level and had spent every generation since then proving the estimate wrong, not to the Veshen, not to anyone, but to themselves. "We didn't build this because of you," she said. "We didn't prepare because we feared you. We barely thought about you at all. We built this because building is what we do. We climb because the mountain is there. We prepare because the night might come. And when your probes arrived, we let them see whatever they wanted to see because you were not the reason. You were never the reason." She looked at him directly. "But you are here now. And now you see what negligible looks like after 400,000 years of climbing." Dole returned to the unfailing resolve with his team. No one spoke during the walk back. The groomed grass whispered against their boots, and overhead the human fleet continued its silent, terrible procession, ship after ship after ship, each one casting a shadow that briefly erased the daylight, each one a monument to a judgment that had been wrong for longer than most civilizations existed. In his quarters, Dole opened the journal to Yenth's entry. He read the 6 lines again. He looked at the sketch, the hunched primate, the chipped stone, the single annotation. Negligible. He picked up his own recording stylus and began his report. The first line took him 10 minutes to write, because every word he chose felt inadequate for the distance between what the journal described and what he had seen. Preliminary assessment Earth revised. Previous classification negligible. Current classification do not approach. He paused, deleted the last 3 words, tried again. Current classification sovereign, full sapient civilization, technological tier exceeding Conclave standards by an estimated factor of. He stopped. He didn't have a number. The Veshen classification system didn't have a tier for what he had seen, because the system had been designed by a civilization that assumed it occupied the top position, and the woman on the terrace had shown him, without raising her voice, that the assumption had been wrong for so long that correcting it felt less like an update and more like an apology. 400,000 years earlier, the primate who had followed Yenth's survey team through the delta vegetation had died at the age of 31, which was old for his kind in that era. He had never discovered metallurgy. He had never built a structure that survived a single rainy season. He had chipped stones into shapes that his group could not understand and that he could not explain, because he did not have the language for what he had seen, only the memory of it. Bright figures moving through the tall grass, carrying objects that hummed, stepping into a shape that rose into the sky and disappeared. He had spent his remaining years trying to make a stone do what those objects did. He failed. His children failed. Their children failed. But they kept trying, generation after generation, not because they remembered the sky visitors. That memory faded within 3 generations, but because the trying itself had become embedded in something deeper than memory. A restlessness. A conviction that stones could be made to do more than cut, that the sky was not a ceiling but a door. 400,000 years of that conviction, unbroken, compounding, refined through 1,000 collapses and 1,000 rebuildings, had produced the city that Dol Rithik now sat beside in his survey cutter, writing a report that no existing classification could contain. The primate had not been negligible, he had been early. Tavan entered Dol's quarters without announcement, which was a breach of protocol that told Dol everything about his second state of mind. "The fleet count," Tavan said. "I ran it 3 times. And 14,000 combat-rated vessels in the orbital shell visible from our position. The sensor array can't reach the far side of the planet, but based on the density distribution, the total fleet strength is somewhere between 40 and 60,000 capital ships." Dol set his stylus down. "The Conclave's total fleet strength across all sectors is 11,000. "Yes. And their individual ship mass exceeds our grand carriers. The largest vessel I catalogued masses approximately 400 times our largest grand carrier. Commander, it has its own gravitational influence. Our navigation system flagged it as a celestial body before reclassifying it as a ship." Dol leaned back in his chair. The journal sat open on the desk beside him, and the sketch of the hunched primate stared up at the ceiling with crude charcoal eyes that saw nothing and everything. "Tavan, do you know what the Conclave will do when they receive our report? They will dispute it. They will claim sensor malfunction. They will send a verification team with better instruments, and that team will see exactly what we saw, and then they will argue about it for 100 cycles while committees form and dissolve and reform. And then—" Tavan's mandibles worked silently for a moment. "And then someone on a committee will suggest that a harvest fleet could still take the planet if they committed sufficient force, because the Conclave has never encountered a species it could not eventually consume, and the institutional memory of success is stronger than the evidence of a single survey report. And then the harvest fleet will arrive, and then—" Tavan stopped. He looked at the viewport, where the distant city gleamed in the afternoon sun, its towers throwing long shadows across the engineered grassland, and above it, the silent patrol fleet moved in its endless, patient circuit. "And then we will learn what 400,000 years of preparation actually looks like when it stops being patient," Tavan finished. Dol spent 3 more days on the surface. The woman, who identified herself as Regional Director Vasara Cohn, did not restrict their movement. She assigned no escorts. She answered questions with the measured clarity of someone who had rehearsed nothing because rehearsal was unnecessary when the truth was sufficient. On the second day, she took Dol to a facility at the city's edge, a long, low building of the same unidentifiable composite, set into the hillside like a bunker. Inside, in a climate-controlled gallery lit by diffused sunlight through fiber-optic channels in the ceiling, Dol found the history of everything the Veshan had missed. The exhibits were not triumphalist. There were no victory monuments, no martial displays, no propaganda murals depicting humanity's rise as a heroic arc. Instead, they were archaeological, precise, labeled, presented with the dispassionate rigor of a species documenting its own evolution the way a geologist might document strata. The earliest artifacts were stone tools, crude, chipped, indistinguishable from the implements Yenth had described 400,000 years ago. They sat in their cases under soft light, and beside each one, a small placard listed its approximate age, its material composition, and the site where it had been recovered. Dol stopped at one case. The tool inside was a crude blade, chipped from river stone, and beside it lay a second object, the same shape but rendered in a material that Dole's handheld scanner flagged as an unknown alloy. A copy made recently of the ancient design. "We keep making them," Vasara said, standing beside him. "Once a generation, an artisan creates a new version of the oldest tools, using whatever the current material science allows. It's not ritual. It's not nostalgia. It's a reminder." Of what? Of what we started with. Of how far a species can travel between one stone and one star if it refuses to stop walking. Dole moved deeper into the gallery. A timeline ran along one wall, compressed to a scale that could fit 400,000 years into 90 meters of display. The first third was nearly empty, sparse dots marking the slow crawl from stone tools to fire to language. The middle third grew denser, and the final third was so densely packed with milestone markers that they merged into a solid bar of light. "The acceleration," Dole said, studying the timeline. "Exponential," Vasara confirmed. "The first 100,000 years produced fire and simple language. The second 100,000 produced agriculture and early metallurgy. The third produced written communication, mathematics, and basic engineering. The fourth," she gestured at the glowing terminus of the timeline, where the markers had become a continuous stream. "The fourth produced everything you see outside this window. And we are still accelerating." Dole looked at the crude blade and the impossible alloy copy, and he thought about Yenth's sketch, the hunched figure, the chipped rock, the word negligible, and he felt something he had never felt in 20 years of survey work. The vertigo of standing at the bottom of a distance he could not measure. On the second morning, before the gallery visit, Dole had walked alone to the base of the nearest tower. Tavin had advised against it. Prell had offered to accompany him with a full sensor suite. He had declined both. He wanted to see it without instruments between his eyes and the surface. Up close, the tower was not simply tall. It was alive, or something so close to alive that the distinction became philosophical. The composite surface breathed. Not literally, not with respiration, but with a slow, rhythmic pulse of thermal regulation that Dole could feel against his palm when he placed his hand on the wall. Warm, then cool, then warm again, cycling at a frequency that matched the ambient temperature's fluctuation. The building was regulating its own climate the way a body regulates its own heat. He pressed his palm harder. The surface yielded slightly, not like metal, not like stone, but like muscle under skin. Something firm beneath something flexible. The wall recognized the pressure and responded. A faint luminescence bloomed around his hand, pale blue, tracing the outline of his clawed fingers against the surface. Identification scan. The building was reading him. "It won't harm you," a voice said behind him. Dole turned. A human male stood 10 meters away, younger than Vasara, dressed in the same dark uniform, watching Dole with the relaxed curiosity of a naturalist observing an unfamiliar species. Not concerned, not guarded, curious. "The towers are semi-sentient," the young man said. "Responsive architecture. They monitor structural loads, atmospheric conditions, population density, energy flow. The blue light means it's cataloging your biometrics. Atmospheric composition, body temperature, mass distribution. It does it with everyone who touches it. It's learning about me. It's learning about everything. It has been for 80,000 years." The young man tilted his head. "You're the first non-human to touch it. It's probably confused." He said this with a faint smile, not mockery, not superiority, but genuine amusement at the idea that an 80,000-year-old building was encountering something new. Dole removed his hand. The blue luminescence faded slowly, like a question left hanging. "Your people build things that think," Dole said. "Our people build things that learn," the young man corrected. "There's a difference. Thinking implies a destination. Learning implies a direction." He looked up at the tower, and his expression carried the same reverence Dole had seen on Vasara's face at the stone clearing. "We gave it a direction. It's been walking that direction for longer than your civilization has existed. We don't know where it's going. Neither does it. That's the point. Dole stared at the tower, a structure older than his entire species' recorded history, breathing against his palm, learning from his touch, and felt the scale of what humanity had built press against his mind like deep water against a hull. Prell had wandered ahead to a section of the gallery displaying recovered debris. She called out to Dole, her voice carrying the particular flatness of a technician trying to stay professional in the face of something that had voided her composure. "Commander, you should see this." In a sealed case under neutral lighting lay a collection of objects that Dole recognized instantly: a navigational relay, a power coupling, a fragment of hull alloy with Conclave manufacturing stamps still visible on its surface. "Probe components," Prell said. "These are from the monitoring probes we sent. They've been disassembled, studied, cataloged, and placed in a museum." The placard beside the case read, in translated Veshan script, "Conclave Survey Probe, recovered Visit 14 of 27, disassembled for technical analysis, year 212,400 of the current era." Dole stared at the display. The Conclave's probes, instruments designed to observe without being observed, equipped with stealth systems that had fooled every other species they had ever been deployed against, had been captured, taken apart, analyzed, put back together, and sent on their way with falsified data. And then the components had been placed in a glass case with a placard, as if they were pottery shards from a moderately interesting archaeological dig. "They treated our probes the way our museums treat handaxes," Tavan said from beside him, and in his voice Dole heard the sound of a worldview ending. On the evening of the second day, after the gallery visit, Dole sat alone in the unfailing Resolve's mess compartment and attempted to eat. The rations tasted the same as they always did: compressed protein, mineral supplement, the faint alkaline tang of processed nutrients. But his appetite had departed somewhere around the moment Prell had shown him the dissected probe components in their museum case, and it had not returned. Tavan found him there, staring at an untouched meal tray. "I've been running comparative analyses," Tavan said, settling into the seat opposite. "Our database has records of 412 spacefaring civilizations. I compared their development timelines to what that gallery showed us. And the fastest recorded civilization in the Conclave database, the Keithrani Ascendancy, went from first metallurgy to interplanetary capability in approximately 90,000 years. It was considered an anomaly. Textbooks called them the rapid exception." Tavan paused. "Based on the timeline in that gallery, this species achieved the same milestone in approximately 40,000 years, more than twice as fast as the fastest civilization on record. And then they kept accelerating. Commander, the Keithrani Ascendancy collapsed at technological tier 6. They burned too hot, expanded too fast, exhausted their resource base and fragmented. That is what happens to rapid developers. Every model predicts it. Rapid development is inherently unstable. And yet the city outside this viewport has been standing for approximately 80,000 years, based on the structural dating I was able to run. The oldest sections of the subterranean infrastructure predate the Veshan Conclave's founding by 68,000 years." Tavan's mandibles locked. "Commander, they were building underground cities while our ancestors were still developing written language." Dole pushed his meal tray aside. "The models predict that rapid developers collapse." "Yes. This species developed faster than any recorded civilization, and did not collapse." "They collapsed repeatedly, Commander. The gallery documented at least 7 major civilizational collapses across their history: wars, ecological failures, technological misfires. They nearly extinguished themselves at least 3 times. Tavan's voice carried the tone of someone who had found a puzzle that offended his sense of how the universe was supposed to work. "But they rebuilt. Every time. They collapsed and they rebuilt, and each rebuild went further than the last. No other species in the database has done that. When civilizations collapse, they stay collapsed. These, he gestured at the viewport. These kept getting back up. Dole thought about the stone in the clearing. The primate who had watched the sky visitors and gone home to chip rocks into new shapes. The children who had failed and the grandchildren who had failed and the great-grandchildren who had failed, and all the generations after them who had kept failing in new and different ways until the failures started becoming successes. And then the successes started building on each other. And then 400,000 years of getting back up. That's the thing we missed, Dole said quietly. Not the intelligence, not the tool use, the stubbornness. On the third day, a second human fleet entered the system. This one did not descend into the atmosphere. Dole's ship detected it on long-range sensors. A formation of approximately 12,000 vessels holding position at the system's edge, oriented outward toward deep space. That's their border patrol, Vasara said when he asked. Permanent station. They've been there for approximately 60,000 years. 60,000 years. We established the perimeter when we confirmed that other spacefaring civilizations existed in this region of the galaxy. We detected your second monitoring probe and extrapolated that you would eventually return in force. So we built a border and we staffed it and we waited. She paused. We've been waiting for 60,000 years. Your visit today is the first time anyone has come through. Dole processed this. A border fleet of 12,000 warships, each one massing more than a Conclave Grand Carrier, maintained at permanent readiness for 60,000 years, longer than the entire span of Veshan civilization, against the possibility that someone might come. That is, he searched for the word, that is an extraordinary commitment of resources for a threat that never materialized. Vasara looked at him. Her expression was the one he had seen on the terrace, not amusement, not hostility, but the deep, patient steadiness of a species that had decided, a very long time ago, that readiness was not a cost but an identity. Commander Rithik, your people looked at ours 400,000 years ago and saw animals. You wrote 6 lines about us and classified us as a future resource to be harvested at your convenience. You didn't do this out of malice. You did it because we were, at that time, exactly what you described, weak, scattered, pre-sapient by your standards. And you were right. That assessment was accurate. She turned to face the city behind them, its towers catching the late afternoon light. But you made one error. You assumed that what we were was what we would always be. You filed us under Negligible and never updated the file. And in the time it took you to forget about us, we went from chipping stones to building ships that make your fleet look like the river canoes we used to cross water before we learned to build bridges. Her voice had not risen, her posture had not changed. And yet Dole felt, for the first time in his career, the particular dread of a professional who has just realized that every assumption underlying his profession is wrong. Not slightly wrong, not correctable with a revised model wrong, but wrong at the foundation, wrong in the way that means the building has to come down. On the 4th morning before departure, Vasara brought Dole to one final location. A park at the city's center, open green space beneath the towers, where the engineered grass gave way to a small clearing of natural soil, untouched, unmodified, surrounded by a low wall of river stone. In the center of the clearing stood a single object, preserved under a transparent dome of the same unidentifiable composite that formed everything else on this world. It was a stone. A chipped, crude, hand-sized stone blade, its edge still rough where it had been struck from a river cobble 400,000 years ago. No copy, no alloy reproduction, the original. We found it at the site where your first survey team landed, Vasara said. Carbon dating placed it within the window of Commander Yenth's visit. It was made by the individual who followed your team through the vegetation, the one who watched. Dole stared at the stone. "This is the most important object on our planet," Vasara said. "Not the warships, not the defense platforms, not the cities, because this is where it started." A primate watched your people walk across his world carrying tools he couldn't understand, and instead of forgetting what he'd seen, he picked up a rock and tried to make it do what your tools did. He failed, but he tried, and his children tried, and their children tried, and 400,000 years later the trying has not stopped. She looked at the stone, and for the first time Dole saw something in her face that was not professional composure or controlled strength. It was reverence, the deep, personal reverence of a descendant standing before the first crude act of the ancestor who had set everything in motion. "We owe that individual everything," she said. He had no language for what he saw, no framework for what your technology was. No concept of space travel or metallurgy or engineering. All he had was the refusal to accept that the sky was a ceiling, and that refusal, that one stubborn act of reaching for something beyond his grasp, is the reason you are standing in a city that your instruments cannot classify. Later that evening, Vasara found Dole standing at the edge of the engineered grassland, staring up at the orbital defense platforms visible as faint silver points against the darkening sky. Even at orbital altitude, even reduced to points of reflected sunlight, they were visible to the naked eye, which meant they were enormous. "How many of those are there?" Dole asked without turning. 48 in the primary ring, 1,200 in the secondary network. Each one is autonomous, self-repairing, and maintains enough stored energy to sustain defensive operations for approximately 200 years without resupply. 200 years. We planned for the possibility that a conflict could last longer than a single generation. Our ancestors were familiar with long wars. She stood beside him, hands clasped behind her back, looking up at the same sky. "Commander, I want to be clear about something. We are not showing you our defenses to intimidate you. We are showing them to you because we want your report to the Conclave to be accurate. Your previous reports were not, through no fault of your own. We ensured they were inaccurate. This time, we would like the record corrected." "Why now? Why allow us to see the truth after 400,000 years of concealment?" "Because your visit tells us something. The Conclave sent a manned survey team. That means you've moved this world from deferred observation to active assessment. The next step in your protocol is a Harvest Fleet deployment recommendation. We've read the protocol. We know the timeline. Within approximately 200 of your administrative cycles, a Harvest Fleet will be dispatched unless the survey team's report gives them reason not to." She looked at him. "We are giving you a reason." Dole stared at the defense platforms. Each one a self-repairing weapons platform with 2 centuries of operational endurance, 48 in the primary ring, 1,200 in the secondary network. Behind those, the fleet, 40 to 60,000 capital ships. Behind those, the subterranean infrastructure, 12 kilometers deep, pressurized, engineered at the molecular level. Behind all of it, a civilization that had been preparing for this moment since before the Veshan had discovered fire. The Harvest Fleet would come because the Conclave did not know how to do anything else. It would arrive expecting the resistance a negligible species could mount, disorganized, desperate, technologically inferior. It would find something else entirely. "You could have destroyed us," Dole said. "When we entered the system, when we landed, at any point during our visit, you have the capability." "Yes. Why didn't you?" Vasara was quiet for a long moment. Above them, the orbital platforms caught the last of the daylight and burned like a crown of steel. "Because we remember what it was like to be negligible," she said. "We remember what it was like to watch something cross the sky and not understand what it was. We remember what it was like to be small and frightened and armed with nothing but a rock and the refusal to stop trying. And because we remember that, we do not destroy people who are smaller than us. We show them what we are, and we let them choose." She paused. Your conclave will choose. We hope they choose wisely. On the night before departure, Dole could not sleep. He lay in his bunk aboard the unfailing Resolve, staring at the ceiling, listening to the ship's environmental systems cycle through their filtration routine. Through the small viewport beside his bunk, the city's nighttime illumination painted the sky a soft amber, not the harsh artificial glare of Veshan urban centers, but something warmer, more deliberate, as if even the city's light had been designed to be gentle on the eye. He had brought the journal with him. He opened it again in the dark, running his clawed fingertip along Yenth's sketch. The charcoal lines were fading. 400,000 years of storage had degraded the pigment, and the primate's face was becoming indistinct, blurring into the fibrous texture of the page. In another few centuries, the sketch would be gone entirely. The 6 lines of text, inscribed in mineral-based ink, would last longer, but even they would eventually fade. 6 lines. The entirety of the Conclave's engagement with a species that had, in the interim, built cities that thought, ships that dwarfed planets, and a border defense maintained for 60 millennia. 6 lines for 400,000 years of climbing. Dole thought about the young man at the tower who had spoken about the difference between thinking and learning. He thought about the stone blade under its dome, the original, not the copy, the crude chipped edge that a primate had struck from River Cobble because he had watched something cross the sky and refused to accept that the sky was all there was. He thought about the 78 worlds the Conclave had harvested in his career, the species inventories he had filed, the dismissive shorthand, pre-sapient, tool-adjacent, negligible, that he had applied to living things the way a warehouse clerk applied labels to crates. He had never wondered what those labels cost. He had never stood on a labeled world and met someone's eyes and understood that the label was a door that could have opened but had been stamped shut instead. He thought about what this report would mean, not to the Conclave's administrative machinery, that would grind through its cycles regardless, but to the 900 other deferred harvest worlds on the current audit list. 900 worlds, each one classified and filed and labeled with the same casual shorthand that Yenth had used for Earth. 900 worlds where something might be happening that the probes were not calibrated to see, and the models were not designed to predict. How many of those labels were wrong? How many stones were being chipped into new shapes on worlds the Conclave had written off? The question settled into Dole's mind and stayed there, heavy and immovable, and he knew it would still be there when he woke, and when he filed his report, and when he returned to Veshan Prime, and for every day of the rest of his career. Because once you have stood on a world you classified as negligible, and watched its sky fill with ships your species cannot build, you cannot go back to labeling crates. The journal sat open on his chest, and the fading sketch of the primate stared past him at the viewport, where Earth's cities glowed like embers in the dark. 400,000 years separated the sketch from the glow. Everything between those 2 points, every failure, every collapse, every rebuilding, every refusal to stay down, was the story that no survey report could contain. He filed his report from orbit on the 4th day, after the unfailing Resolve had lifted off from the engineered grassland and climbed back through the atmosphere. The human fleet did not intercept them. The border patrol at the system's edge did not hail them. They were allowed to leave with the same unhurried indifference with which they had been allowed to land. That indifference was, Dole realized, the most frightening thing of all. A civilization that felt the need to intercept or challenge was a civilization that perceived a threat. A civilization that let you come and go as you pleased, watched you with the mild interest of a mountain watching weather, and returned to its own affairs before your drive signature had faded. That was a civilization that had moved so far beyond the concept of threat that the word itself had become archaeological. He transmitted the report in full. 800 pages of sensor data, atmospheric readings, material analyses, fleet counts, architectural surveys, and his own written assessment. which ran to 47 pages and began with the sentence he had rewritten 9 times. The species previously classified as negligible has achieved a technological and civilizational state that exceeds conclave capability by a margin that our classification system is not designed to express. He attached Yenth's journal entry, all 6 lines of it, and the sketch. And at the bottom of his report, below the data tables and the fleet projections, and the material analyses that the Conclave scientists would spend decades attempting to replicate, Dole wrote a final paragraph that was not part of any standard survey format. I have spent 20 years assessing worlds for the Conclave, and in that time I have cataloged 1,100 species across 400 systems. I have seen civilizations rise, stall, and collapse. I have seen intelligence emerge, flicker, and extinguish. I have never seen what I saw on Earth, not because their technology surpasses ours, though it does, not because their military capability dwarfs ours, though it does, but because they built all of it, every tower, every ship, every blade of engineered grass, starting from a point so far below us that we did not consider them worth a second look. They did not build it to defeat us. They did not build it to prove us wrong. They built it because building is what they are. And they will keep building long after the Conclave has joined the list of civilizations that underestimated a primate with a stone and learned, too late, what 400,000 years of stubbornness can produce. He signed it, Commander Dole Rithik, Survey Team 14, Earth Assessment Revised. And then he sat in his quarters and looked at the sketch one more time, the hunched figure, the chipped rock, the eyes that stared at nothing, and he understood that the primate in the sketch was not a portrait of what humanity had been. It was a portrait of what the Veshan had failed to imagine they could become. The unfailing resolve jumped to transit drive, and Earth shrank behind them, a blue-white marble in the dark, ringed by ships, crowned by stations, wrapped in the quiet, patient readiness of a species that had started with a stone and never stopped climbing. Dole closed the journal and placed it in the ship's archive. Yenth's 6 lines would travel back to the Conclave alongside Dole's 800 pages, and somewhere in the space between those 2 documents lay the distance that Negligible can travel when you give it 400,000 years and the stubbornness to keep going. He did not expect the Conclave to understand, but he hoped, with the faint, professional hope of a man who has seen something that has permanently altered his sense of scale, that they would at least read the full report before they made their next mistake. Because the woman on the terrace had been right about one thing, they were welcome to try. And the fleet above Earth, 60,000 years old, patient and silent and vast beyond counting, was the answer that would be waiting when they did.